This isn't some dystopian satire. This is America in 2025. Across the country, thousands of churches are being converted into bars, nightclubs, luxury condos, climbing gyms, yoga studios, skateboard parks, breweries, and yes, coffee shops. Lots and lots of coffee shops. Every year, between 6,000 and 10,000 churches close their doors permanently in America. And many of those beautiful buildings, some over a century old, with stunning architecture and irreplaceable craftsmanship, aren't being torn down. They're being transformed. Dr. Tricia Bruce, a sociology professor at Maryville College, explains, there are thousands of old churches that have actually been converted or that are in the process of being converted. There are certainly some churches that have been converted into bars, to rock climbing gyms, to restaurants, condos, and residential use is very common. In Britain, more than 3,500 churches of various denominations have shut in the last decade alone. Across the UK, an estimated 1,000 churches have been converted into everything from restaurants and bars to gyms and supermarkets. So today, we're exploring this fascinating and controversial trend. Why are churches closing at such alarming rates? What's happening to these sacred buildings? Who's buying them and why? Is this transformation tragic or practical? And what does it reveal about the changing relationship between religion, real estate, and American culture? Whether you find this trend heartbreaking, fascinating, or just bizarre, stick around. Because the story of churches becoming coffee shops and gyms is really a story about the dramatic transformation of American faith and community. Let's start with why this is happening, because you can't understand the conversion trend without understanding the church closure crisis. The math is simple and brutal. Churches are expensive to maintain. Congregations are shrinking. The economics no longer work. Between 6,000 and 10,000 churches close every year in America. Meanwhile, only about half that number of new churches open. We're losing thousands of churches annually, with no signs of slowing down. The reasons are familiar by now. Young people are leaving religion at unprecedented rates. The knowns, people with no religious affiliation, now outnumber Catholics and evangelicals individually. Church attendance has plummeted, especially accelerated by the pandemic. But here's what people don't always realize. Even when a congregation dies, the building remains, and that building represents a massive problem. These aren't just any buildings. Many churches are architectural treasures. Gothic Revival, Romanesque, Victorian, Art Deco masterpieces built by skilled craftsmen a century ago. They feature soaring ceilings, hand-carved woodwork, stained glass windows, pipe organs, intricate stonework. They're also incredibly expensive to maintain. Old buildings need constant repairs. Roofs leak, foundations crack, heating and cooling systems fail, plumbing needs updates, electrical systems require modernization. And churches were built for hundreds of people. When your congregation drops to 30 elderly members, you're trying to maintain a massive building designed for 300. The costs become unbearable. So churches face an impossible choice. Keep pouring money into a building they can't afford while their congregation dies slowly, or sell the property while it still has value and use the proceeds for ministry elsewhere. Increasingly, churches are choosing to sell. But who buys a church? And what do they do with it? That's where things get interesting and sometimes controversial. The most common conversion is residential. Churches are being turned into luxury condos, sometimes called condos. One old Methodist church in Atlanta, which was down to about 60 members when it closed, was sold to a luxury real estate developer 7 years ago. Now it's become a series of 3,000 square foot condos. Developers love churches for several reasons. First, the spaces are unique. High ceilings, dramatic architecture, historic character, large windows. These aren't features you find in typical residential buildings. They create stunning, one-of-a-kind living spaces that command premium prices. Second, the locations are often ideal. Churches were typically built in central, accessible locations on main streets, in walkable neighborhoods, near town centers. As urban areas have gentrified, those locations have become highly desirable. Third, the structures are sound. Churches were built to last centuries. The bones are solid. Yes, they need updates, but the foundation, walls, and basic structure are typically in good condition. In New York, faith-based organizations account for about 92 million square feet of land, 2.5 times the size of Central Park. That's an enormous amount of prime real estate in a city desperate for housing. Michael Levy, founder of Geneva Transatlantic Holdings, says, "I expect to see more conversions going forward as churches close." One particularly striking example: a condo conversion of the ex-Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in New York between Columbus and Amsterdam Avenues. The $24 million conversion offers elegant red tile towers, a choir loft-turned-bedroom, and a tapered 32-foot ceiling. The development team is also adding a 2-level sanctuary and community facility for the 20-member congregation, while Mount Pleasant's bishop will get one of the apartments. So the church gets to stay in a small portion of the building they can actually afford, while the rest becomes high-end housing. It's a win-win, sort of. But residential conversions are just the beginning. Churches are becoming breweries, gyms, nightclubs, skate parks, and countless other commercial ventures. In Knoxville, Tennessee, an old church will soon house a bike shop, coffee shop, yoga studio, boutique hotel, and brewery. The original sanctuary, where generations once worshipped, is being converted into a food hall with 4 different restaurant operators. In the UK, a chapel in London hosts a 25-meter swimming pool instead of pews. The health club also boasts a gym, a steam room, and even a sauna housed in the old confessional box, meaning you can sweat out your sins instead of sharing them. In Paris, a 19th century chapel is now used as a climbing wall and co-working space. At the Chapel Nightclub, once a 19th century Pentecostal church in Salisbury, Wiltshire, a DJ booth now occupies the space the altar once did. In Bournemouth, Sanctum Nightclub inhabits what was once St. Andrew's United Reformed Church. Some former churches have been converted into restaurants, bookstores, museums, art galleries, theaters, event spaces, co-working hubs, and even mosques. The creativity is remarkable, but so is the controversy. Because not everyone sees these conversions as practical solutions to empty buildings. For many people, especially those with deep connections to these churches, the transformations feel like desecration. Imagine you were baptized in that church. Your parents were married there. You attended services there every Sunday for decades. Your grandparents are buried in the cemetery next door. That building isn't just bricks and mortar. It's sacred space woven into your family's story. Now someone's doing yoga where you once took communion. People are drinking beer where your grandmother prayed. Strangers are sleeping in condos where you experienced some of the most meaningful moments of your life. That's painful. It feels like erasure. Like your history, your community, your faith tradition is being commodified and repurposed for profit. The Catholic Church in particular has struggled with this issue. In 2018, the Vatican hosted an international conference titled, "Doesn't God Dwell Here Anymore?" and published guidelines for dioceses looking to sell church property. The guidelines included prohibitions against selling sacred relics and turning over buildings to sordid use, such as liquor stores, abortion clinics, and nightclubs, and a reminder to destroy altars when a church ceases to be a church. Pope Francis reminded delegates that selling church buildings should be approached thoughtfully, with consideration for what the space meant to the community. But here's the tension. What's the alternative? Let beautiful buildings decay and collapse because we can't afford to maintain them and won't allow anyone else to use them? Some argue that repurposing churches for community benefit is better than letting them fall into ruin. Some congregations are turning unused church property into affordable housing, shared working spaces, or spaces for nonprofits. By doing so, they've turned buildings that were once seen as expensive liabilities into assets for the common good. Pastor Jasmine Smothers in Atlanta is saving First United Methodist Church from closing with what she calls a God-sized plan. She's using the church's most valuable asset, their land, to build more than 300 apartments in the high-rent city, most of which will become affordable housing. Smothers argues this is ministry. The church uses its resources to provide housing people desperately need, while generating revenue that allows the church to continue its spiritual work. Dr. Denny, a theologian at St. John's, suggests, the process of desacralization begins when people in the community are no longer aware of who is missing. The closure of a church opens the possibility of a gift to the community. In other words, the building became less sacred when the people stopped coming, not when the new owner moved in. Many Catholics believe the church's real estate holdings are a gift, and the question is simple. What's the most loving thing we can do with them? That's a powerful reframing. Rather than seeing church sales as tragic losses, what if we saw them as opportunities to serve communities in new ways? But let's be honest about the complications, because this process isn't always clean or noble. Some church developer partnerships have crumbled, especially in church-heavy areas like Harlem, where parishioners sued developers after promised new buildings went undelivered. In other cases, apparently unscrupulous pastors cut side deals that drained already depleted coffers. There are also zoning battles, landmark preservation fights, and community conflicts. Some projects need to navigate tricky paths among city officials who prefer clear windows to stained glass ones, and Landmarks Preservation Commission officials who may take the opposite view. The process can play out for years. And then there's the question of who profits. When a church sells for millions to a developer who builds luxury condos, does that money go to continuing ministry? Or does it just disappear into denominational bureaucracy? Do congregations get a say? Or do distant church authorities make decisions without input from the people who actually worship there? These are messy, complicated questions with no easy answers. Now let's talk about what these conversions reveal about American culture, because this trend isn't just about real estate, it's about values. First, it reveals the prioritization of experience over institution. People still seek transcendence, community, and meaning, but they're finding it in yoga studios, coffee shops, breweries, and gyms rather than churches. Dr. Bruce notes that these conversions represent adaptive reuse, taking old structures and giving them new purposes that serve contemporary needs. A coffee shop in a former church still serves as a gathering place. A gym in a former sanctuary still hosts a community pursuing something greater than themselves. In this case, physical transformation rather than spiritual. A brewery in a converted church still creates space for fellowship, just with beer instead of communion wine. The forms have changed, but the human needs remain constant. We need places to gather, connect, belong, and pursue meaning together. Second, these conversions reveal the commercialization of sacred space. Everything is for sale, including buildings once considered set apart for divine purposes. This makes some people uncomfortable. It feels like nothing is sacred anymore, like everything can be commodified and repurposed based on market demand. But others argue we've always done this. Medieval European churches were built on pagan sacred sites. American churches were often built on land taken from indigenous peoples. Buildings have always been bought, sold, repurposed, and reused based on changing needs. The question is, what makes something sacred? Is it the building itself? Or is it the community and practices that happen within it? If a community no longer exists, if worship no longer happens, if the space is empty and deteriorating, is it still sacred? Or has it already been desacralized by abandonment? Third, these conversions reveal urban economic pressures. The housing crisis, gentrification, and the need for community spaces in cities are driving these transformations. With official pushes to add housing in places where apartments were historically limited and faith-based organizations controlling vast amounts of urban land, church properties represent major opportunities for development. In cities where housing is desperately needed and land is scarce, Using massive church buildings for a few dozen elderly worshipers one morning a week feels like poor stewardship of resources. Converting those spaces to serve hundreds of people daily makes economic and social sense. Fourth, these conversions reveal generational differences in how people relate to physical religious spaces. Older generations often have deep emotional and spiritual connections to church buildings. They're repositories of memory and meaning. Younger generations tend to see buildings as functional spaces. If the space isn't being used for its original purpose, repurpose it. This isn't callousness. It's pragmatism shaped by different cultural contexts and priorities. So what's the future of this trend? Will it accelerate or slow down? Given that 3,500 churches closed in Britain in just one decade, and thousands more continue closing annually in America, conversions will likely increase dramatically. As more churches close, and experts predict this will continue for at least another decade, more buildings will need new purposes. Developers, entrepreneurs, and community organizations will continue finding creative ways to use these unique spaces. We're likely to see more intentional approaches. The Vatican's conference and guidelines suggest religious institutions are taking this more seriously, trying to ensure buildings serve community needs while respecting their history. The Church of Scotland's reforms include reconfiguring and reshaping around fewer buildings and dedicating £25 million to supporting local missions with particular emphasis on church planting. Their grants have facilitated alpha courses run in local coffee shops and funded pipelines for training youth ministers. In other words, they're accepting that many buildings will close, but using the resources to invest in new forms of ministry not dependent on maintaining expensive real estate. We may also see more hybrid models where churches maintain small portions of buildings for worship while commercial or residential uses occupy the rest. This allows congregations to stay connected to their historic spaces while making them financially sustainable. And we'll likely see continued controversy. Every conversion will spark debates about appropriateness, sacredness, community benefit, and what we owe to history and tradition. Here's my conclusion. The transformation of churches into coffee shops, gyms, and condos is neither purely tragic nor purely practical. It's complicated, messy, and deeply revealing about where we are as a culture. On one hand, these conversions represent real loss. Communities die, traditions end, sacred spaces become commercial ventures. History is erased or commodified. People with deep connections to these buildings experience genuine grief. On the other hand, these conversions represent adaptation and possibility. Beautiful buildings are preserved and used rather than demolished or abandoned. Communities gain housing, gathering spaces, and services they need. Resources are redirected from maintaining empty buildings to actual ministry. The question isn't whether we should or shouldn't convert churches. When congregations die and buildings sit empty, conversion is often inevitable. The question is how we do it, thoughtfully or thoughtlessly, with respect for history and community or purely for profit, in ways that serve genuine needs or just developer interests. As one advocate put it, what makes a place sacred? Can we have church without buildings? Is it wrong to convert churches to brewpubs and condos? How about museums or libraries? Many Catholics believe the church's real estate holdings are a gift, and the question is simple. What's the most loving thing we can do with them? That's the right question. Not, should we convert churches? But, what's the most loving use of these resources? Maybe a coffee shop where people genuinely connect is more sacred than an empty building. Maybe a gym where people pursue health and community serves God's purposes as much as a church with no congregation. Maybe affordable housing built on church land is the most Christian thing you could do with the property. Or maybe we're losing something irreplaceable when we turn sacred spaces into commercial ventures, and we should fight harder to keep churches alive even when it's difficult and expensive. I don't have simple answers, but I do think this conversation matters, because the future of thousands of beautiful, historic buildings is being decided right now. And those decisions will shape communities for generations. If this video made you think, share it. If you've been in one of these converted churches, or if your childhood church was sold and repurposed, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Do you find these conversions tragic or practical, disrespectful or creative? Let's keep this conversation going with honesty and respect for the complexity involved. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.